Welcome to This Is Not About Your Body, a body neutrality podcast where we talk about all the real shit body image issues are actually about because they're never just about the way you look. I'm your host, Jessie Nealand, and today I have with me anti-diet dietitian and body image coach Mya Kwon. I found Mya on Instagram where she goes by the name at foodbody.peace and immediately felt resonance with her work. And I know y'all love it when I have experts on here to talk about food and eating because our relationship to food is so tangled up with our relationship to our bodies. And moving away from diet culture is often the hardest part of the body neutrality journey. So I'm really excited to talk about food guilt, food rules, and food police today, especially with the holidays coming up. So welcome, Mya.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I'm going to have you start with the basics. Just tell me a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Yeah, so this is my second career actually. And when I was in my corporate world and a workaholic, nutrition was something that never really crossed my mind until I was really burned out after 7 years of really not taking care of myself. My eating was all over the place. And, back in the days in college and growing up, I had my fair share of, trying all the fad diets and things like that. But when I got into nutrition, I never thought that I would end up doing the work that I do now. I thought I was going to tell everyone to stop eating sugar, eat all their quote unquote like healthy foods. And it was really fortunate how I stumbled upon the world of anti-diet approaches. That was in my second year of my grad school, where I got to do a year-long adolescent medicine fellowship in the area of eating disorders, helping teenagers across all spectrums of eating disorders and body image difficulties heal their relationship with food and their body, and really got the opportunity to be trained by some amazing anti-diet dietitians. And that's when I was first introduced to the world of things like intuitive eating, health at every size. And it was quite fortunate that I had that exposure before I actually got my license as a registered dietitian. Because usually the dietitians who I meet who do get into the space didn't start off in their career in this place and only found kind of the problems with weight bias as they were doing kind of weight loss work. And I never had to do that, which was so fortunate. And that was being trained in eating disorders was my opportunity to really see that, wow, nutrition and physical health is not just about physical health, right? It's also can't really have physical health without emotional and mental health as well. And so even in this space of anti-diet and intuitive eating, my work really encompasses seeing, us as a human being holistically. We're not just our physical body, we're our emotional self, or spiritual, or like all parts of us that make us uniquely you, right? And that's how I see the food and body piece work in the way that I do that with clients now. And so in my online private practice now, I have various ways that I support clients who are struggling in their relationship with food and body. And it's always from that lens of your holistic self and looking at all areas of your physical, emotional, mental, spiritual being.
So this is something I really love about your work, because I think there are so many people in the intuitive eating anti-diet space. There's tons of people who put out really great content about, all of the topics around food and eating. But I don't often see those same people acknowledging the role that the deeper issues play, like the shame, the fear, the identity, unmet needs, all of those things. And the way you talk about it, it's never like, even if you're talking about just the food, nutrition, eating piece, it's never far from, the topic. It's always right there. It feels so cool to me because I think it's really unusual. And I'm curious, because that's different than just the intuitive eating and anti-diet education you got. How did you come to understand that piece of it? And why do you think so many educators and providers don't tackle it?
Great question. I think how I was exposed to it was also very fortunate after that year-long adolescent medicine fellowship that I talked about. So right after completing that and out of grad school, my first official career as a registered dietitian was actually at a university college counseling center, student counseling center. And so that was where I began my work. And
Huh.
this was an environment where I was the only non-mental health clinician, and I was working alongside 20 other mental health therapists, and then me,
Oh,
right? And
wow.
so my supervisor was a therapist. My whole team were an army of therapists, amazing therapists. And I worked there for 7 years. So it was inevitable
Yeah, you were steeped
that
in it.
I was steeped in it of the mental health world
Yeah,
in itself, and also in seeing the connections that it has with body and eating disorders and disordered eating. Even though I kind of knew about it while I was being
yeah,
trained in eating disorders, I didn't get to see it and experience it from, but I never got to do that actual work, right? So being in
yeah,
a counseling center or any type of mental health environment is very different from what usually dietitians get exposed to and start their training, which is in a clinical hospital. Um, and so,
right.
and in our training as dietitians, we really don't get any education around mental health at all. I can't
I
remember a single
know.
course in grad school that touched upon that. I mean, maybe we had
Yeah,
1 hour of eating disorders and 1 hour of intuitive eating, but even then, that wasn't enough time to really touch on the deeper layers of the
yeah,
difficulties that I often get to talk about in my work now. And so being in that environment, I got all the same trainings that the therapist, all their continuing education training,
mm-hmm.
all the different counseling modalities. And when I learned that therapists actually have their own therapists and do their own mental health work, I was like, whoa, and that's
Yeah.
when I first started my own mental health counseling, my first exposure to
Oh,
therapy, of seeking a therapist, and doing my own inner work, not really directly related to food or body, but addressing those deeper issues of
yeah,
my self-worth and sense of identity, and my childhood experiences that shaped me who I am, and just developing a deeper understanding of who I am and what struggles I had. And as more and more as I started to attend to clients in that environment and getting to work very closely with therapists, and often my student clients would be
yeah,
seeing me, but also seeing a therapist who was working right next door in the office, and I got to collaborate with them in real time almost. And so
yeah.
it was a really rich experience to not just have a deeper understanding of the work pertaining to food and body directly that I was doing with my clients, but also getting the insight that my colleagues were able to provide in sharing the work that they were doing with my clients. And so it
Yeah.
gave me that multidimensional perspective.
Oh, that is
Client.
amazing. I love that.
Yeah, and
Um,
that was also my first time that I got to do group therapy, facilitate group therapy with my therapist colleagues. So
wow.
my current online signature course, which I often introduce it to my clients as, it can feel like group therapy because it's kind of a
Mm-hmm.
hybrid of group therapy and online coaching. That model first came from the experiences of facilitating group work with my therapist colleagues, first back in
Yeah.
2016, and it has evolved over time. So I think that time period of my professional career deeply influenced my work and who I am, and just how I
Yeah.
clients.
Oh, I love it. So I've seen you use a tool to help educate people on the fact that your relationship to food actually has deeper roots and issues underneath. Can you describe that tool, the iceberg tool, and how you use it?
Yeah. So I wish I could give proper credit to where I first picked that up. It was probably back in those days when I was getting first trained, but it really resonated with me. And I think it resonates
Yeah.
with so many people. So when we have food and body struggles, there is kind of the surface of the symptoms, which I see as the tip of the iceberg. That's what we see, and is more evident of what's going
Yeah.
on. That can be things like, oh, I hate my body. Oh, I must control food. I'm restricting and binging. And so these are things that people are usually aware of that's happening, that that they know that it's not serving them, but it's
Yeah.
hard to change.
It's the
Uh,
things they Google too and
yes, it
seek out
is.
help with.
How do I
Yeah.
fix binge eating? How do I
Yeah.
fix body image? But what a lot of people don't understand or not yet aware of is what's underneath that iceberg, because underneath the iceberg is the tip of the iceberg is this deeper part of that iceberg that is actually fueling these surface level of the symptoms that we
Yeah.
see. And so, for instance, with something like binge eating, it could be being deprived of like not having your needs met, whether that's physical needs of not eating enough because you're restricting, or unmet emotional needs of not knowing how to cope with negative emotions, or having very difficult, depression or anxiety, or having really difficult relationships, or any other circumstances in your life that you don't know how to control, that then get the body or the food somehow becomes the scapegoat of something to control and distract yourself from. And so these are just a few examples of what that under the iceberg things could be. And for a lot of people, these are usually not just one thing, right? It's a multitude of complex factors of a lot of different things. And they can also be things that are more about the person's kind of characteristics or tendencies, things like perfectionism or very black and white thinking, the need for control, and these things that are things that come up in their other areas of their life, but also deeply influence their relationship with food and body. And so I use it for metaphor to help clients see one, it's kind of normal to have these underlying issues, and they might be aware of it, but they might not fully understand how it's impacting their relationship with food and body. And that's kind of bridging that kind of connection of helping clients understand what's fueling the symptoms can help us go deeper in our work, so that we're not just working on how do I stop binge eating, but more of how do I resolve the need, the urge to binge beneath the iceberg.
This is so much of what I do as well. I think it's so cool to see someone. I mean, obviously you work with body image too, but like, and I work with food stuff as well, but the focus in each of our work is sort of like the opposite side of the spectrum, but it's so similar, and really cool that you're helping people with this specifically around food, because I know those are the things people are Googling late at night, are trying to find people to follow on Instagram for support. Like, those are the things nobody thinks to themselves, I wonder if my underlying self-worth issue is causing havoc in my life, or whatever. They're like, need to stop binging.
Exactly.
Okay, so I want to ask you about a super common issue for people who are either in a space of disordered eating disorders, or just, still in diet culture, whatever, which is food rules. So I want to have you maybe give a little definition of like, what is a food rule and how does a person know if they have them?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't think anyone has asked me before. So food rules can be very overt or sneaky, right? And it's any belief that you have around food that leads to controlling food, eliminating food, or prevent you from eating the foods that you actually want to, right? So this is different from saying, I try to not eat dairy because I get a stomachache if I do.
Right.
That's actually being connected to your body's needs and doing the kind thing for yourself, so that it actually serves you. A food rule is different in that it doesn't actually serve you, and it stems from a need of like control or from fear and anxiety. It really is fueled by fear and anxiety, I think. And so these are those kind of common beliefs that say I must, and they're also pretty rigid a lot of times, right? There is no flexibility to it. It's like, I am bad if I eat sugar, or sugar is evil, or I must eat as little carbs as possible, or this one just came up recently with my client, which was, I can eat carbs, but I shouldn't have more than like one carb source in one meal. So that's a sneaky, right? So these are, if we think about it, it prevents you from, it's like you have to fight yourself because, I actually want to have both the sandwich and the sweet potato fries. But if I have this rule that says, you're bad if you eat more than one kind of carb in one meal, then it's like you have to give up the sweet potato fries and then later feel deprived because you didn't fully enjoy what you wanted to. And if you did eat it, then you feel guilty and bad. So it doesn't serve you either way. You can listen to the rule, or you can break the rule.
Right.
Serve you either way. So that's a good way to kind of see if a belief about food is actually serving you or not. And if it doesn't, then it might be a food rule that is actually negatively impacting your relationship with food.
Yeah. So something I do with clients sometimes is have them create an inventory of their food rules, and they tend to be shocked at how many they have, at how widespread they are. Because most people may be consciously aware of like a little bit, like don't eat too many carbs. But when you really have to go through and write them all down, like can't eat carbs after 6 p.m., have to, can't eat too much, can't have seconds. It can be about the volume, it can be about the type, there can be whole foods off limits. Like all of these things, a lot of times people are not even really aware that they're constantly following them. So I'm curious, in your experience, where do they come from? If people aren't consciously thinking to themselves, these are the rules I must follow all the time, what's going on with that?
Diet culture. Right? When diet culture is something that is just seeped into really like all areas of our lives, right? And if we kind of pin it down more specifically, I think the research kind of shows us that our beliefs around food and body are formulated or informed by three main things, which are media, family, and peers. And diet culture makes its way into all of these areas very
Yeah.
heavily. Right. And so there's kind of the overarching like diet culture idea of, being very controlling about food, looking at food in a very dichotomous way of like good foods versus bad foods, or healthy versus unhealthy. And our kind of everyday contacts of, our peer groups, are the media that we consume, the family that we grew up in. That's where we pick up our own specific food rules that we then internalize. And then it becomes your own food rule. If you grew up in a family that said, I had a client who has really difficult relationship with sweets and sugar, right? And she feels awful, guilty. Anytime she eats them, it doesn't matter how little, she'll eat it, or how she justifies it. She ends up feeling guilty all the time. And we were able to uncover that, okay, kind of the surface level food rule is sugar is bad. And therefore, if I eat sugar, I am bad. But then, when we kind of really dug into where did this come from, it was from her childhood, where she grew up in a household where her mom really demonized sugar. It was something that only you could have on a really special occasion, on a holiday, on a birthday, and any time else that you wanted sugar, that you expressed a desire for sugar, that she was made to feel really guilty, right? It's like, you're such a bad girl for wanting this bad thing. So when you have that kind of experience when you're 6 years old, right? And now she's in her 40s and it still stays with you. And so that's usually where a lot of these stronger hold of food rules come from. It starts way early on in probably our earlier experiences around food and body.
So I feel like this might be a little bit of a silly question, but how true are people's food rules generally? How factually or nutritionally sound are they?
They are not. Absolutely not. Right. And I know it's so hard for people to decipher that because again, we live in this very diet culture influenced world where food gets demonized for all kinds of reasons. And that can be often the tricky part to get over because there are three questions that I have like clients ask and help them kind of debunk food rules when we work on food rules. And the number one is this actually like factually true? Is this evidence-based and factually true? And that can be the one that takes some, learning and unlearning and maybe some support from a professional who can explain the science. I love explaining the science and breaking it down for my clients because often they are very rigid, they are very one-sided, and even how kind of diet culture or the so-called wellness culture really sneakily formed these food rules. The beliefs that inform our food rules is by kind of like using what I call like pseudoscience, right? It's like, it makes it sound scientific and it's so hard. It makes it even harder to decipher, is this actually true? But they're using kind of these sciencey words and citing things like research. But when you actually look into what they're citing or what they're talking about, it's either, scientifically illogical, or they're cherry picking science where you can find evidence, you can find a research paper for really anything, but it's what is the quality of the evidence? What is kind of the amount of evidence that has surmounted around that topic? And that's some of the areas that are, usually difficult for people who don't have that background to decipher. And that's of, the work that I help clients to kind of debunk. And they really appreciate getting to learn the science of things because it helps them overcome some of those fears around a lot of the food rules that are, very heavily fear-based.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of like a common food rule and how you debunk it or sort of disprove it?
Mhm. So things like, let's say I can eat a piece of fruit, but I can't eat a piece of cake, right? So if
Mhm.
I want a piece of cake, I should eat a fruit because it's a whole food. I think
Mhm.
something like that is something that a lot of people subscribe to. Um,
Yeah.
or, another like along the same lines could be honey is better than cane sugar, something like that.
Mhm.
So these are all in that kind of same family. But what people don't realize is there's a way that I kind of help people break down what carbs are and sugars, like
Yeah.
sweet. The added sugars are one form of carb, and a fruit is also one form of carb. There's other forms of carbs as well, like starchy vegetables are a form of carbohydrates.
Mhm.
Grains are a form of carbohydrates, and we tend to think in this kind of good carb, bad carb mentality, right? So a fruit is a better carb than a sweet, or
Yeah.
a potato is a better carb than a piece of bread, that kind of idea. And it's actually when our bodies digest carbohydrates, whether it's started as a starch, started as a fruit, started as a piece of cake, once it starts to digest in the body, and the last place that is digested is in our small intestine, where it gets digested down to the smallest unit of a carbohydrate. And there are three types of different monosaccharides, which just means like a one sugar unit. I know this might be getting a little too scientific.
No,
Stay
I
with me.
love it.
There are three types of single sugar units that all carbs that you eat break down to. And so from the small intestine, it gets delivered to your liver. And here's the thing, in your liver, which is where the carbs that you digested breaks down, before it goes into your bloodstream, they are all converted into glucose. And glucose is what we commonly talk about as blood sugars.
Yeah.
And so if you lost me along the way of explaining this, all you need to know is your body actually can't tell the difference between
Yeah.
whether that glucose that ended up in your bloodstream came from a piece of banana or it came from a piece of cake. It ends up
Yeah.
the same unit of glucose. And so this is kind of like a mind-blowing revelation for a lot of my clients. So it's like, really? So my body can't tell the difference if it came from a banana or a piece of cake? And I'm like, yeah, that's true. And then people are like, well, then why do we talk about like good carbs and bad carbs? And the reason is because in a banana, there are other added nutrients that maybe the piece of cake
Yeah.
doesn't have. So there's a little bit
Right.
more fiber, there's a little bit more potassium, and that's great, but that doesn't mean all the carbs we eat has to be that way, right? Because a
Yeah.
carb is carb and they all provide us with energy. That's the carb's number one job, to provide us with energy. And so that's why
Yeah.
we have to eat enough carbs in every day. And so that can give us a lot of freedom to people to understand, okay, so the helpful thing that actually serves my body is to, one, eat enough carbs. And when I eat the carbs, they can come from a variety of sources, from grains, from fruits, from starches, and from sweets. It's okay to
Yeah.
eat sweets.
Absolutely. So good. Also, I honestly feel like because of the pseudoscience that leads to a lot of these false beliefs around food and any number of other things, it actually is really helpful to use science to push back, because otherwise, like, you could just say, hey, it doesn't matter. And they're not going to believe you, because in their head, they're like, yeah, but there's research for the other way of thinking. So I love having the science to disprove it. And I think that's really cool example. So one thing I wanted to ask is, what's the relationship between food rules and food fears? Because I guess I tend to think of a food fear like the kind of thing that, if a person has avoided cake for years and years, and then they think, okay, now I have to eat this cake to like do my healing journey around disordered eating, it would cause panic, right? Because they've been religiously following this rule for so long. But I'm curious if you see there being any other relationship or a specific difference between food rules and food fears.
I would say that the food rule is about the belief around food, and then the food fear. So the food fear is informed by the food rule. I think if people say that I'm afraid to eat the cake, because then there is probably a belief underlying that fear of what is going to happen, that what
Yeah.
they're afraid of that might happen if they were to eat the cake. And
Yeah.
so I would ask those questions to a client when they say, I'm terrified of eating cake because I've been avoiding it for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I ask them, what are you afraid that might happen if you eat the cake? And they might say, I'm afraid that I'm going to get diabetes. I'm afraid that I could suddenly
Mm,
gain a lot of weight. And then that helps us uncover the underlying belief, um,
right.
the rule around it. It could be eating sugars leads to diabetes, or it could be
Yeah.
around eating added sugars leads to weight gain. Weight gain is bad, right? So it helps us kind of identify the beliefs around the food that
Yeah.
causes fear. So I think in that way, it's related to each other. It's like the food rule is informing the food fear.
Yeah. It's like a symptom of it, but not all food rules come with that much fear. It's usually the kind of rules that have been given either a lot of power or has been there a long time. Like those are the ones.
Mm-hmm. And I often
So,
have
yeah, go
clients
ahead.
I often have clients rank their food rules hierarchy,
Uh-huh.
so in like a pyramid format, where the bottom of the pyramid could be the food rules that are less scary, like you said, the ones that are not ridden with so much fear. It's like
Yeah.
it's there, you're aware that I shouldn't eat after 8 p.m., but if I eat after 8 p.m., I feel a little guilty, but then I can get over it, kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
Right. But then at the top of the pyramid, as we go higher on the pyramid hierarchy, it could be at the top of a pyramid, they are the ones that are attached to a lot of fear, like,
Mm-hmm.
eating more than one dessert a day
Yeah.
is going to ruin my health. And like
Uh-huh.
anytime you eat more than one dessert, you're terrified and you go down like a negative spiral that I'm going to get unhealthy and this is going to happen, that's going to happen. And so by ranking these food rules, it helps us to kind of see, okay, which ones do we feel ready to kind of work on? And it's usually the ones kind of on that at the lower hierarchy that
Yeah.
are not as scary, because once you overcome the ones there, then you gain more kind of self-trust and confidence that, hey, I can
Mm-hmm.
get through this, and then build up to feeling that courage to tackle the ones that
Yeah.
are on top.
Something that I often think about around this is that we often will live our lives trying to follow rules that are imaginary. And we do this in so many ways. Like when I look back, I think of all the rules I followed around, sort of gendered beauty and body ideals, like I have to wear this because I have these ratios in my body. Like when I broke those rules, nothing bad happened. And I was shocked. Like I really believed that if I dressed in an unflattering way, something awful was going to happen. And I think it's just fascinating and sort of like depressing, but also really liberating as people start to break the rules and go, oh my God, this whole time I've been like meticulously following a rule that doesn't even matter.
Mm-hmm.
You talk a lot about the food police. So I want to bring that into this conversation because the food police and the food rules are so linked. So tell me about the food police.
Yeah, so the food police is who's policing the food rules, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
who's coming after you and telling you that you did something really bad and you must be punished when you break that food rule. So I mean, the food rules wouldn't really be impacting us so negatively unless there was the judgy food police who's coming after you about it. And so
Yeah.
oftentimes this can be a form of a bigger, harsher inner critic. So I see the food police as part of an inner critic that a lot of people have, because a lot of clients I work with are such amazing, compassionate human beings, and they have so much kindness,
Yeah.
compassion, and patience for others, but not for themselves, right?
Yeah.
And when this show up in their own lives in the area of food, it's a really nasty and mean food police voice. And so whenever they break those so-called food rules, then it's this
Yeah.
loud voice saying, you should be ashamed, you're so disgusting, now you have to go compensate, what are you going to do,
Hmm.
you know, how are you gonna add in another run? Or now you have to stop eating this for the rest of the month, whatever it might be. It's this constant loud chatter voice that is happening in their internal dialogue when they break these so-called rules. And it can really send people down a spiral. You know, it's not just about that moment that you eat the cake, but it could be the whole day or the whole week after that. This food police constantly is nagging at you, that you reminding you that you were so bad and that you have to be punished or must compensate somehow.
And what would you say the purpose of the food police is? Like, what's it trying to accomplish by being so loud and aggressive?
Yeah. You know, any part of us, I try to remind my clients, because I'm also very big on self-compassion in my work, is that even these really mean, nasty part of us are trying to protect us and keep us safe. And they just don't know how to do that best. And so that's why they're doing this in a way that they think is helpful, but it's actually not helpful. And so when there is this really strong core belief that you internalize that eating sugar makes you a bad person, then the food police is trying to act as your kind of moral guidance, right? To say, to keep you on a quote unquote good track, because it wants you to be a good person, right? But we've learned that, you know, we want to be a
So heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. And I think being able to kind of look at it from that lens can help people see, like, oh, okay, right? Like, it doesn't mean it's me being inherently like broken, or that I'm a really like nasty person inside, because you're absolutely not when we look at how they treat other people. But it's this kind of in a way, it's this like twisted moral compass, because the rules that they are trying to enforce on you were not true rules to begin with, because you're not actually factually true, and they're not serving your overall well-being, because it's actually damaging your relationship with food. It's damaging your mental health. It could be damaging your physical health. And so I like to put it in that light, that it's trying to keep you safe, but it doesn't know how to best do that.
Oh, yes. I sometimes will use the analogy of like a helicopter parent, where, you know, we can recognize that a parent who is keeping their toddler from like ever falling down or whatever is just trying to keep them safe. Obviously, it comes from a place of love, but we also recognize that that's going to do harm to the kid, who's never going to build resilience and trust in themselves, right? And it is so self-protective and so misguided. And when you don't know that, it can feel like it's just you, that you're a horrible, mean person.
Yeah. And it really is powerful to have that different perspective. I use a similar analogy of a tantrum throwing 3-year-old kid.
You do it from the other perspective.
Yeah, from the other perspective, because I often talk about this, like the two parts of our brain, which is, you know, on the frontal part of our prefrontal cortex is our CEO brain. That's where your logic and information and all the knowledge, like the smart you, is up there. And then in the back of our brain is our, what I call the scaredy cat brain. And that's actually, the scaredy cat brain is what's triggered and where the food police is coming from, because it's like, hey, you did something wrong and that's not good, but we need to like keep you safe. So you got to go back to being good. But it's coming from this place of fear that something bad is going to happen. And so it can be like this tantrum throwing kid who doesn't know what they truly need. Maybe what they truly need is assurance, or affection, or to tell them that I love you and you're safe, but they don't know how to communicate that need. So they just throw a tantrum.
I love that.
So if we can see it in that way, like when the food police acts up, that mean or bully acts up, it's like, whoo, hey, I hear you. I know you're trying to keep me safe, but this is actually not helpful. And here's a different way that we can look at this. And you don't have to keep doing that, right? When we can talk to that part of us in this more gentle way, then it can help like calm it down a little bit, and calming the tantrum throwing kid down a little bit. And when we calm down, then we can access what we know up here. So even when I walk clients through the science of carbs and sugar and all that good stuff, it's like when the scaredy cat brain is acted up, when the food police is being really loud, you can't access that information because this scaredy cat brain part of you just hijacks your whole brain. And so it's first by using, a bit of self-compassion and this nurturing voice to calm that part of you down. And then you can calm down and be like, okay, I'm in a better headspace now. My heart is not beating at, 100 miles per hour anymore.
Mhm.
So now let's think about this. Is sugar actually killing me? And then it's like,
Right.
oh, wait, we just learned that your body can't tell the difference with whether it came from a banana or a piece of cake.
Right.
Okay, so it's okay that I eat a piece of cake. I'm not going to die. I'm safe. Right. And then we can start to dismantle that belief, that strong food rule that used to have
Yeah.
such a hard grasp on you.
Yeah. So would you say that in those moments, like, are we going to hear from someone the kind of common refrain of, I intellectually understand XYZ, but I just don't feel it? Like,
Mhm.
is that the scaredy cat brain has taken over?
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of clients that I work with usually, they're not totally new to the idea of intuitive eating or why, having food rules and diets are not really serving them. They already quote unquote know
Yeah.
that, but it's like, but
Right.
what I know is one thing and what I feel is a different thing. And why is there that disconnect between what I know and how I feel? And it's
Yeah.
because when you're so activated, when that scaredy part of you is so activated all the time, every time you feel like you're doing something bad and wrong with food, then you don't have that space to
Yeah.
actually, try something different from the new knowledge that you learn because your body is just on
Yeah.
adrenaline and, is just going to focus on that fight or flight response, which is what
Yeah.
is happening when you're in that, scaredy cat brain mode. And so it starts with, being able to practice that self-soothing. And a lot of times that's a part that's difficult for a lot of people because they've been stuck in
Mm.
that pattern of not knowing what to do when that
Yeah.
when that food police triggers the scaredy cat brain. And that's a value in working with a coach or some kind of provider who understands this, who can create that safe space for you while you try to
Yeah.
patterns and kind of rewire your brain to create a different response around these rules.
Yeah. It's also like another counterintuitive thing in this is that the shame you feel and all of the stuff that comes in the wake of judging yourself for having an inner critic, like trying to reject your inner critic and make it shut up, actually activates your system further and makes it
Exactly.
harder to bring all of those, sort of conscious parts of yourself back online.
Absolutely. It's like people often say, I feel guilty for feeling guilty.
Yes, yeah. Meta guilt.
Yeah. And it's that, any type of that inner critic response doesn't really serve us in any way, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
serve us in healing our relationship with food and body. It doesn't serve us in helping us feel better about ourselves or connecting to our body, because that's also an often barrier for people to really work on their relationship with food, is because
Yeah.
they're so detached from their body because it doesn't feel safe to be in their body when they are triggered in that way
Yeah.
24/7, right? You want to run away
Totally.
from it, you want to disconnect from it. And so, yeah, that part can absolutely be difficult. And which is why I think when someone says that they have either a really loud food police voice or that they have a mean inner critic, or they're so flooded so often that they can't access the knowledge that they know,
Yeah.
then the work that they need to start on first is developing those self-soothing practices and accessing that compassionate, building more self-compassion
Yeah.
in themselves, which can be done, by working on it introspectively on your own, but also can be really helpful when you can have someone who you can channel that safety through.
Mhm. Also, so body neutrality is my whole jam, but I really, it would be more accurate to say like everything neutrality, because emotions are absolutely a part of that. And cutting off the spiral where you're like, I'm freaking out. And then you go, but it's okay for me to freak out. There's no spiral to follow, right? If you say I'm freaking out and it's stupid that I'm freaking out and I have to stop freaking out immediately, like you're going to fall into a spiral. So I love this kind of neutral, compassionate, accepting lens going into those parts of yourself and saying, I see that you're trying to do something. What do you need?
Yeah. I love that point that you made about, feelings and emotions, because it's often trying to avoid the quote unquote negative emotions, or that causes more of that problem, right? Like you
Yeah.
don't like feeling guilty, or you feel guilty about feeling guilty, and that creates further guilt. You feel shame about your body, and it's like, oh, but I should embrace my body. And then it's like, but I can't.
Yeah.
And I feel ashamed even more. And it's like not being able to acknowledge and accept, or get
Yeah.
curious about what that quote unquote negative feeling is actually about. Right?
Yes.
And so when we can stop judging the guilt and the shame and start to get curious about it, of like, ooh, I wonder what this is about. And that's the lens that I love looking at emotions through with my clients, where it's so strange, where once I read, I don't remember where I read this, but it was talking about, it was making a comparison to emotions with our physical sensations. And
Mm.
so, how, we have these different sensations of taste and smell and touch, and some of them can be unpleasant, right? You can smell something beautiful, you can smell something really rotten.
Yeah.
There can be a really good like tactile feeling, or you can burn your finger on a stove and that really stings and hurts. But when we have these negative physical sensations of smelling something really bad, or you touched a burning stove, it doesn't feel good, but we don't really kind of like judge ourselves for smelling something bad, right? It's like, oh, that smells bad,
Hmm.
but it's like, I'm bad for smelling something bad. We don't do that, and like
Yeah.
a burn is actually helping us, because if we're like, oh, that's hot, then it helps you have this reflex of,
Yeah.
protecting yourself from hurting yourself further. So any type of sensation, physical sensation, is actually information for us. It's not good or bad.
Hell
And
yeah.
what if we look at emotions in that same way? Like
Yeah.
no emotions are good or bad, but it's just how physical sensations are a way that we feel the outside world. What if our internal emotions are a way to give us information about our internal world, and nothing
Yeah.
is good or bad? And like looking at it in this way, it can help us kind of create more curiosity of like, oh, I wonder what this guilty feeling is really about.
Yeah.
Oh, this shameful feeling doesn't feel good. And what does this mean? Where did this come from?
Hmm.
When we can be more curious about it than to try to run away from it, or stuff it under the rug, sweep it under the rug,
Yeah.
or judge ourselves for having it, right? Then we can actually work with it and maybe learn something more about ourselves
Hmm.
and take care of ourselves better.
Absolutely. I actually have a self-study course called Make Friends with Your Feelings, because that's like
Ooh.
such a big piece of the work I do. So now that we're into the emotional realm, I want to ask about the other major issue around food, which is food guilt. Obviously, we've already kind of seen a little bit how it links to food rules, food police, but I'd love you to give a definition of what food guilt is and what causes it.
So guilt is something that says you did something wrong, right? So it's like this moral police. And so I would say, excuse me, I would say food guilt is a result of um, breaking the food rules and the food police prosecuting you. And so it's this lingering like feeling, the result of you did something bad.
Yeah.
And it starts to bring this kind of moral lens to like who you are. It's like, I'm a bad person because I did something bad.
Yeah.
Um, and when we feel this food guilt, it is so easy to kind of go down a spiral, because now you have to kind of redeem yourself to be good. And
Mm.
in reality, right, like food is not a good or bad issue to begin with.
Right.
So it's like it's a very twisted moral compass that we have. Like having
Hmm.
a morality as a human being is a beautiful thing, so that we can align with doing the good things for humanity, not hurt other people, not create injustices, and know when we're doing something that is of disservice to ourselves and others, and
Yeah.
course correct, right? Food should not fall under that realm,
Right. Right.
period, right? And so food guilt is coming from that lens of seeing food as a good or bad lens, a moral lens.
In your estimation, can a person experience food guilt without having broken a rule, or is it exclusively when there was a rule that they broke?
I think there's always a rule around it, because it's like, why you
Interesting.
feel guilty is because you feel like you did something wrong.
Yeah, I guess what would you have done wrong?
Exactly. So
If
that
there
is what
wasn't,
the
yeah.
rule is about, right? Like why you feel bad is because of the belief that informed you're good or bad.
Right. I feel like the only example I can come up with is, something I see a lot of like intuitive eating stuff saying, which is the only reason to feel guilty about food is like if you stole it from someone else,
Okay.
because yeah, that obviously it would have broken sort of a social rule, but not an internal one. I'm wondering how many people experience guilt without even knowing they broke a rule.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when a lot of
Because
the
that seems to me like, yeah,
food beliefs and rules are so internalized, especially if they began so early on, and usually they do. Where did
yeah,
you learn that eating sugar is bad? It usually goes back to like under 10 years old, right? And so they
yeah,
lived with that for 20, 30, 40 plus years.
mm-hmm,
And that was just always a part of your life, and you never really knew anything different. And so, of
yeah,
course, it's hard to acknowledge when that's always how things had been.
yeah,
But it still doesn't mean it. So it makes sense why you may not be aware of it and may not even know that how that belief is actually
yeah,
you to feel, to have struggles around food. But oftentimes when people are able to kind of identify that and say, and be able to kind of consider what, there's a different way to look at sugar, what, there's a different
right,
way to think about eating carbs, then that opens up a whole new world of
mm-hmm,
how they engage with food, how they think about food, and as a result, resolve that guilty
yeah.
feeling around food.
So when we talked about this before, and I was asking sort of what does the work look like for overcoming a lot of food guilt, you mentioned the sort of court system analogy and the inner bully and inner judge. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit about that.
Um, so I think I use either like food guilt or food police or any of the things that we talked about in a way that, whatever resonates with a client the most, because essentially they all kind of come back to the same thing. There is some
Okay.
kind of belief around food. And then there is some kind of like inner judge or bully or food police, whatever you want to call it, that is enforcing the rule.
Yeah.
Um, and so we may like start with kind of thinking about what are the moments that you feel most stressed out and guilty around food. So that will give us insight into what that big belief around food that is causing this
Yeah.
distress, guilt around food might be. And so it starts with really kind of identifying and dismantling that rule itself. And so again, like kind of going back to a carbs is bad example, it's like, well, what does that carbs is bad like mean? Is it I shouldn't eat more than one grain a day? Is it I shouldn't eat more than one dessert a day, or in whatever
Yeah.
time frame it is? And then specifically working on dismantling that guilt of like why it's okay to eat more than one grain a day, because actually your body needs a minimum of like 15 pieces of toast each day.
Yeah.
Right. That is the science behind it. And so that might be the first layer of arming yourself with more like true information of what can counter the belief that you have. And then it goes to that next step. It's not about just like learning information, right? It's about actually practicing it out. And so then like creating these small steps to kind of challenge those food rules in real life, whether it might be, okay, the next time that I feel I really want to, eat great two bowls of pasta, like both for lunch and dinner, something I never used to be able to do because of this
Mm-hmm.
food rule that I shouldn't eat pasta more than once a day. Then it's like being very conscious of when that like fearful feeling comes up of like, oh, I'm about to eat pasta for the
Yeah.
second time in this day. I'm really scared, which is normal because this belief has been here for 20
Right.
years. But I also learned that our bodies actually need a lot more amount of carbs than I thought initially. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing a good thing for my body. I'm doing a good thing for my body to fuel it with adequate fuel. I'm also doing a good thing for my relationship with food because I
Yeah.
really am craving the pasta twice a day today. And by allowing myself to have it, I'm increasing
Yeah.
my satisfaction around food, right? So to bring in these ways to affirm why what you're doing is something that is actually serving your bigger purpose, which is to have
Yeah.
joy, to have more peace in your relationship with food. And so then if and in that process to try to stay connected to observe like what happens when you eat the pasta like twice in a row. Like, are
Right.
you Does it feel, less scary while you eat it? Or maybe the first time you try it, you still kind of freak out. And then it's like, I did it, but I still freaked out. And then that's something that we can kind of process through. But the
Yeah.
important thing is you were brave enough to try it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it can be this kind of incremental process of one, learning information, two, kind of practicing changing how you
Yeah.
implement and work with that food rule so that you can slowly
Yeah.
start to get over it.
What I love in all of this is that it's a way of helping restore or give someone permission to tap into their own agency and ability to disagree with someone. Even if that someone is in their own head at that point. It didn't start there, obviously, but yeah, learning to disagree with people is a very powerful bit of healing. And I think for a lot of women especially, it's really difficult to do because we're taught that external authorities have all the power, they must be right, and therefore I must just follow their rules. And you're really encouraging people to go, I don't know if I agree with that rule. Let me come to my own decision about that.
Exactly. It's breaking the good girl complex, right?
Yeah.
So many women, those who like identify as women, kind of grew up in this society and this framework that as like what it means to be like a good girl, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that kind of language is so kind of still seeped into kind of a lot of like females
Yeah.
upbringing around the experiences of who identify as females, right? Like that you have to be like womanly, that you have to be nurturing, that you have to be kind, that you can't be angry, like these
Mm-hmm.
kind of frameworks. And I love this quote that I read from Glennon Doyle's Untamed, where it said, she stopped being good so she could be free. And I love
Ooh,
that,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's like, don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me how I need to be good or bad. Like, I'm going to be
Yeah.
me, you
Yeah.
know?
So I know that we both are passionate about calling in the social justice component of this work, which I feel like what you're describing right now, like, I'm just imagining someone like arguing with their food police, being like, "Hey, you don't get to treat people like that." That analogy also, if you're fighting injustice and oppression in the world, why not fight it in your own mind? And also, it's the same thing.
It is the
And
same.
calling upon that really, I think, gives people a lot of power and feelings of like righteousness and permission to do that work and cast it off and be like, fuck that. Like, I'm not okay with being oppressed like that.
Exactly, exactly. And that can be such a bigger why and a bigger fuel to going against the grain of like diet culture, right?
Yeah.
And it is about, it starts with me. Like it starts with
Mm-hmm.
like our own relationship with food and body. But when we start to understand kind of the bigger, like the how diet culture fits into this bigger system of oppression, it's no different from,
Yeah.
racism, sexism, like whatever it might, other systems of oppression might be. And I don't know if you read Sonia Renee Taylor's The Body Is Not an Apology, right? Like that book really kind of helped me see that in a whole new
Mm.
way early on
Yeah.
in my career, to really understand diet culture as a system of oppression. And it
Yeah.
helps so many clients to kind of see that bigger framework as well. It's like, this is not just about me, but
Yeah.
just like what we would like all of the people who are struggling with our relationship with food, like, and a lot of like women, again, like if we were to be able to channel this energy of trying to shrink our bodies and control our foods into, different things in the
Yeah.
world, we would rule the world, right? Like there's
Absolutely.
so much
Yeah.
energy going into how do I stay small? How do I stay good? How do I control my food? And
Yeah.
it's really like heartbreaking and sad if we look at kind of that
Yeah.
lost kind of potential in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Okay, so you gave me two labels or tools, the compassionate ally and the food anthropologist, and I want to make sure we get to those. So tell me what those are and how you use them.
Mm-hmm. So the compassionate ally is kind of the counterpart of the inner critic. So when a lot of people say like I'm my most harsh inner critic, I have this mean bullying voice all the time. Like what I help people kind of formulate is this other part of you that can calm down that mean inner bully, right? So this compassionate, nurturing voice. And people might say, well, I don't have that nice voice in me.
Right.
I say, well, if you had a loved one, your daughter or your best friend or your partner who came to you and said, oh, this is like what I was trying to do, and I ended up doing this. I'm such a failure. I'm
Mm-hmm.
disgusting. What do you say to them? Do you agree with them to say, yeah, you're disgusting?
Yeah.
And they're like, of course not, I
Right.
would be heartbroken. Like, what do you say to them? And usually their response is something really kind and nurturing. I was like, there's your compassionate voice, right?
Yeah.
So it's like capturing that compassionate voice that they already have and practicing using it towards themselves when the mean inner bully is acting up. And so in my programs, like we go through this exercise of trying to find the right type of compassionate ally voice that really resonates with each person, because it can look drastically different from person to person. And one of my clients had it say, it's my old grandma who was 90 years old, sitting on her porch, petting her chihuahua,
Yeah.
and like, dear, it's okay, don't be too harsh
Yeah.
on yourself. And another client might say, oh, mine is like a diva like Lizzo, and saying like, you don't get to talk to me like that, right? And so
Yeah.
whatever personality type like resonates with you, or maybe you have someone in your life who gives you that inspiration and motivation and strength
Yeah.
when you feel really down about yourself, like channel their voice if you having a
Mm-hmm.
hard time finding your own compassionate ally. But by intentionally practicing that compassionate ally voice towards ourselves, it can really help counter the impact and the intensity of
Yeah.
the mean inner critic that might be, that if you feel like that's constantly on kind of the default voice in your mind. And so that
Yeah.
can be a really helpful tool to start practicing.
I love
And
that.
then on the other hand, the food anthropologist is kind of that counter to the food police, right? So we kind of talked about it earlier about, instead of being judgy and policing about our food all the time, what if we get curious? And so the food anthropologist is this curious, adventurer, explorer, like Indiana Jones. I don't know if everyone knows Indiana Jones anymore, right? It's like, let me see what we can find out about this.
Yeah.
So when you have a food police voice going, hey, you did wrong, you broke a rule, it's like, wait a minute, hold on. Let's see what's going on here. When the
Yeah.
food police says you're bad because you stuffed yourself and you got uncomfortably full, that means you failed. But that's where the food anthropologist can come in and say, oh, hey, you ended up uncomfortably full, and hey, that doesn't feel good, but I wonder what happened here. Like,
Yeah.
why was it so difficult to find that place where you were comfortably full and stop? And then, like, by being curious, it could be, oh, you know what? I started eating when I was super starving after not eating for hours and hours. And
Yeah.
when I start eating when I'm starving, I eat really fast, and then I'm
Yeah.
not really tasting the food. And then I miss that point where I feel comfortably full, and then I just end up feeling stuffed. Like, oh, okay. So we are really hungry to begin with. What if we try to be more mindful of how hungry we get and see,
Yeah.
and not get here the next time, right? So
Oh,
that food anthropologist just really helps us, find different ways and just understand what's
yeah.
going on better, instead of not even looking at it in any other way and going like, hey, you did bad, and you need
Yeah.
to be punished, because we don't really learn from that if we're only
No.
on that good or bad.
So obviously that sounds much more neutral, much more kind to yourself. But what I love about it most, I think, is that judgment and curiosity exist on exact opposite sides of the same spectrum. They're mutually exclusive because judging says, I know everything and I have no further questions. I've come to my conclusion and that's it. And curiosity is, I wonder if there's more information. I'm going to go find out. You can't do both at the same
No,
time.
you can't. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Okay, so holidays coming up, obviously, this is a super triggering time for a lot of people. Food rules, food police, food guilt, food anxiety, so many things come up here. I would be curious to hear if you had any like advice that you give to people who are sort of heading into a space that they know is going to be kind of flaring up their food stuff.
Yeah. I think, yeah, the holidays are a difficult time because there's so many more opportunities to feel triggered. And so now knowing that, a lot of these guilty feelings and this food fears and anxiety like really come from kind of our core beliefs around food. I think just remembering that, and then the next time you go into a holiday meal or a social, a holiday function, and you recognize those voices acting up, can you practice some of these tools that
Yeah.
we talked about today, whether it's coming up with that food anthropologist and saying, okay, the food rule here is saying this is good or bad, or I'm being good or bad. What would the food anthropologist say about this?
Yeah.
Use it as an opportunity to explore instead of being judgy, right? And to
Yeah.
also understand that, this is a process, because if you've kind of lived in that space of, food guilt and food rules for decades, which is often the case with a lot of clients that I work with, to know that it's not something that happens overnight. And so
Yep.
don't feel discouraged if you feel like, okay, I tried to use the anthropologist's voice, but it didn't work, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
it's very likely that it's not going to
Yeah.
go 100% the way you want in your first try. But the important thing is that you're creating awareness around it, that you're thinking about it,
Yeah.
and you have to, intentionally think about this like many, many times before it becomes something like more natural that you can actually do in
Yeah.
practice. And so I hope you can go into the holiday with just a lot of like compassion for yourself, of like, ooh, no wonder I have such a difficult relationship with food when I've internalized a lot of beliefs around this starting from childhood. Here's an
Yeah.
opportunity for me to explore doing things differently, and then just maybe try like one thing that we talked about today,
Yeah.
to just start that journey, and not to think that you have to like fix and conquer all the food rules at once, because that's not
Yeah.
very realistic. And I think a lot of this work is also setting kind of like realistic expectations on ourselves, because that's also something people have difficulty with, of like this perfectionistic mind. I need to get it right. Like,
Get it done in 6-week course.
okay.
You know what I think is interesting here about the anthropologist, I'm like very taken with this idea, because obviously the food anthropologist mostly is an internal experience of like you and what you've eaten. But if you apply that same voice, given that holidays, one of the big triggering stressful things for people is like seeing family or having comments made on your appearance, your weight, your body, what you're eating. I almost feel like you could apply that same lens to your family members. If someone says, "Oh, I'm so bad, I shouldn't eat this," or says, "Wow, you're having seconds," like, I don't know, whatever it is. And instead of being like, "Oh, I guess that means I'm bad," being like, "I wonder what's going on with them. I wonder
Yeah,
what's going on underneath that comment?"
absolutely. Because when other people say things about that to themselves, or even when they say it to you, right? And if you can see that as, oh, what they say about food or body, whether it's directed at themselves or at me, is coming from their own beliefs about food
Yeah.
or body. When we can recognize that, and it's like, oh, that's about their beliefs and
Yeah.
where they are in their relationship with food and body. It has nothing to do with me. Then that can help us kind of protect ourselves from the impact of it. Like,
Yeah.
that's their truth, not mine.
Mhm.
That can
I
be very
kind of
powerful.
want everyone to start asking family members who make comments like this what rule they've broken. Like, literally be like, "Oh, you seem to think that I've done something wrong. Could I ask what rule I've broken by eating
Yeah,
dessert?" Like, that is so interesting to me as a concept of sort of making people aware of their own rules rather than just making yourself aware of yours. But all of it has been amazing. You are so brilliant. I am so happy you came on here. Um, Before we finish, tell everybody where they can find you on the internet and what that looks like.
yeah. So I'm most active on Instagram. My handle is foodbody.peace. That is my website name as well, foodbodypeace.com. And I have a lot of fun things kind of coming up geared towards the holidays and all that. So I would love to communicate with you. And if you follow me from this podcast, don't hesitate to say hi. I love talking to people, and it was such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And everyone listening, thank you so much for being here, and I will catch you next week. Hi everyone, I'm Jessie Nealand. I just want to take a moment to thank you for watching this video. I put out new episodes of my podcast every Tuesday, so be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so that you don't miss those, and feel free to leave me a comment. If you are looking for more information about body neutrality or you want to work with me, you can always find me at my website, jessienealand.com, or you can purchase my book, Body Neutral, a revolutionary guide to overcoming body image issues, wherever you buy books, ebooks, or audiobooks. We can also connect on Instagram or TikTok. My handle is Jessie Nealand. And I make this podcast for free and without any sponsors or ads. So if you want to support my show, you can use the Patreon link in the show notes, and know that your support is always very much appreciated. Lastly, thank you to my brother, Jason Nealon, for creating the music that plays at the beginning of the show. And thank you for listening, learning, and moving toward personal and collective body liberation.